Good evening, and welcome back. Tonight, we're stepping into the long and dramatic story of the Byzantine Empire, the eastern half of Rome that refused to disappear. How did an empire that began as Rome's continuation become something entirely its own, with glittering mosaics, towering churches, court intrigue, and armies fighting on every frontier? And how did Constantinople, a city built between two worlds, managed to endure for more than 1,000 years? As always, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it for you? And if you like these stories, please like and subscribe. This is the easiest way to support this channel. Whether you're settling in for sleep or simply looking for a calm way to travel through history, thank you for being here. Now, let's begin. A rider came through the Golden Gate with mud on his cloak and a leather tube tied to his saddle. He pushed past carts and pedestrians on the main road, then slowed when the street narrowed and the crowd thickened. The city smelled of fish from the harbor, smoke from cooking fires, and sweat from men hauling rope. He kept his eyes forward. A guard at an outer checkpoint stepped into his path and held up a hand. The rider pulled a lead seal from the tube and showed it. The guard looked once, then waved him through. The rider rode on toward the palace quarter, where marble colonnades framed the street, and men in clean tunics walked with their heads up, as if the air itself demanded a straighter spine. Inside the great palace, an official took the tube and carried it past courtyards where fountains ran into stone basins. The messenger waited under a painted ceiling while servants moved through side doors with trays of bread and olives. He watched a clerk press a stylus into wax and copy a line. He watched another man weigh coins on a small scale, then close a wooden box with a practiced snap. The palace ran on routine. It ran on paper, wax, and seals. It ran on the steady movement of orders from one room to the next. Then the tube reached an inner chamber, and the routine changed. A man with a narrow face broke the seal and read fast. He turned and walked through a door without asking permission. Emperor Zeno sat with a few advisors and a map spread on a table. The map showed the sea, the long coastlines, and the old names that still mattered in Constantinople. A servant poured water into a cup and stepped back. The official bowed and handed over the message. Zeno took it without ceremony. He read, and his mouth tightened. The Western court in Italy had fallen. The boy emperor, Romulus Augustulus, had been deposed. The man who removed him, Odoacer, sent the imperial insignia east. The old symbols were on their way to Constantinople, wrapped in cloth and guarded like treasure. The room stayed quiet while Zeno read again, as if a second reading might change the ink. He set the message down and looked at the men around him. They were not surprised by the violence. They were surprised by the finality. For a century, the West had leaned on emergency and improvisation. Generals raised armies with promises. Emperors came and went in a few months. Cities paid ransoms to avoid sacks. Now the West had no emperor at all, and the last act came with the careful politeness of a package delivery. Zeno tapped the table with one finger, slow and steady, and spoke about titles, legitimacy, and the weight of that insignia when it arrived. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The message said one clear thing. Constantinople held the imperial office alone. Outside the palace walls, the city kept moving. The harbor cranes creaked. Longshoremen cursed as they rolled barrels of wine and oil. Bakers shaped dough and slid loaves into ovens. In the hippodrome, the factions argued about races that had already happened and races that had not yet happened. A man in a dye shop leaned over a vat, stained to the elbows, and listened to a rumor that the West was gone. He shrugged. Rome was far away. His life sat within sight of the sea walls, and the sea walls still stood. He cared about bread prices, taxes, and whether the next shipment of grain arrived on time. Constantinople cared about those things too. That was one reason it survived. The city rewarded men who kept lists, counted sacks, and sealed doors. Zeno had other problems that did not wait for news from Italy. He had enemies within his own court, and enemies on the borders. He had soldiers who expected payment, and generals who expected promotions. He had to manage the religious arguments that stirred crowds faster than any tax decree. He also had a very practical question about Italy. Odoacer ruled there as king. He held the army. He held Rome. He also held the loyalty of men who once served imperial officials. Zeno could send an expedition, and that would cost ships, gold, and lives. Zeno could send a letter, and that would cost ink. He chose a third option that fit the Eastern style of survival. He chose to point one threat at another. To the north and west, Theodoric led the Ostrogoths, hardened soldiers with families and wagons, settled uneasily in imperial territory. They were nominal allies, paid with land and promises, and they behaved like men who expected more. Theodoric wanted a kingdom. He wanted legitimacy. Zeno wanted Odoacer removed from Italy. So Zeno spoke to Theodoric as a man speaks to another man who craves a prize. He offered Theodoric authority, a commission, and a road that led away from Constantinople. Theodoric gathered his people and marched. The road west filled with wagons, horses, children, and armed men. Their movement looked like migration and invasion at the same time because it was both. Years later, after battles and negotiations, Odoacer was trapped in Ravenna. He surrendered under terms. Then Theodoric killed him at a banquet. The story traveled back to Constantinople in whispers and then in official letters, polished into acceptable language. The empire gained a result. Italy was held by a king who claimed a Roman mandate and who also understood that Constantinople watched him across the sea. This was how the Eastern Empire operated in the shadow of collapse. It pulled levers. It used titles as tools. It used gold as a weapon. The gold mattered more than the speeches because gold traveled farther than armies. The solidus, minted in bright yellow metal and stamped with an imperial face, passed from hand to hand in Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and beyond. A soldier accepted it. A merchant accepted it. A foreign chieftain accepted it. The emperor's image on that coin turned into food, weapons, and loyalty. When the West broke into kingdoms, their rulers issued coins too, but many of those coins carried the ghost of Roman forms. Some carried an Eastern emperor's name because that name still meant something in the market. Constantinople also held a physical advantage. Theodosian walls rose in long, thick lines, built in layers with towers that allowed defenders to move and shoot. A man on patrol could walk those walls and see the sea in one direction and the land beyond in another. He could see small boats and big ships. He could see distant dust on roads. He could see warning signs early. The walls did not guarantee safety. They bought time. Time allowed the palace to send orders, to gather troops, to pay allies, and to close gates. The West had strong walls in places too, but it lacked the centralized machine that could keep those walls staffed and supplied year after year. When Zeno died in 491, he left a court that hated him and an administration that still functioned. He also left a succession crisis that could have torn the empire apart. A crowd gathered at the Hippodrome, impatient and loud, demanding a ruler who fit their idea of legitimacy. In the palace, Officials and guards chose Anastasius, a civil servant with a careful manner and a reputation for counting money. He was older, with a calm face. He married the widow of Zeno to strengthen his claim. Then he sat down at the desk that mattered and began work. The first years of Anastasius brought internal conflict. Men who had benefited under Zeno tried to keep their power. Soldiers muttered. An Isaurian war broke out as armed groups resisted the new regime. Anastasius responded with steady force. He sent commanders into the rugged regions. He built supply lines. He paid troops. He waited out the rebellion and reduced it piece by piece. While generals fought in the hills, clerks in the capital kept writing. That division of labor kept the empire alive. Men bled in the provinces. Men stamped documents in the city. The taxes still came in. Anastasius cared about money with a directness that bordered on obsession. He reformed the coinage, issuing better small copper coins that made daily trade easier for ordinary people in the market. He also abolished a hated tax on trades and professions that had driven people into debt and bribery. These changes did not come with speeches about mercy. They came with orders, enforcement, and a clear expectation that the state would get its revenue in a form that actually worked. In the background, Anastasius built up the treasury. He did it slowly, and he did it while maintaining the army. By the end of his reign, he left a large surplus, counted in solidi, stacked and sealed. A ruler can buy peace with that surplus. A ruler can buy time. A ruler can also buy a war. War came anyway. In 502, the Persian king Kavad invaded Byzantine territory. The two empires had watched each other across the border for centuries, trading blows and letters, trading prisoners and insults. In this war, Persian troops took the city of Amida after a brutal siege. The defenders died on the walls and in the streets. The survivors went into captivity. The news reached Constantinople, the way bad news always did, carried by tired men who spoke in simple phrases. The emperor's advisors gathered. Orders went out. Anastasius mobilized troops and money and pushed back. The war dragged on through marches and sieges until a peace was arranged, then broken, then arranged again. Anastasius responded the way he responded to everything. He built. He fortified. He laid out a new stronghold at Dara near the frontier, with walls, towers, and storage enough to support troops. He gave the generals a place to hold. He also gave the Persians a problem they would have to reckon with later. Inside the empire, another conflict gnawed at stability. Religion was a constant force in Byzantine politics because it governed identity, legitimacy, and the loyalty of cities. The Council of Chalcedon had defined doctrine in the previous century, and many people in the eastern provinces rejected it. They argued about the nature of Christ in terms that sounded technical and also carried violence in their wake. Emperors tried to maintain unity, and unity came at a price. Anastasius sympathized with those who opposed Chalcedon, and his policies reflected that. Crowds in Constantinople reacted with anger. Factions used religious slogans the way they used race chants, as signals of belonging and threats to enemies. In 512, unrest in the city exploded. People gathered. They shouted. They pushed through streets toward officials and clergy. Soldiers stood in lines with shields, holding the crowd back. Anastasius appeared in public to calm the situation, showing himself as ruler, showing himself as man, letting the people see his face and measure his nerve. The tension settled for a time, then rose again. A rebel named Vitalian turned this tension into a military threat. He gathered troops from Thrace and the Danube frontier, men who had grievances and men who wanted pay. He presented himself as a defender of Chalcedon. He marched toward Constantinople with an army and used the threat of violence to demand changes. He also used ships, bringing a fleet into the waters near the capital and forcing the government to respond on land and sea. The palace did not collapse. It negotiated, then fought, then negotiated again. Bribes were paid, promises were offered. When the moment came, imperial forces struck back and broke Vitalian's power. The city gates stayed closed, the bureaucracy stayed intact, the empire stayed upright. These years look chaotic in the records, and they felt chaotic to the people living through them. A fish seller in the market cared about doctrine when doctrine determined which bishop held authority and which feast days would be celebrated. A soldier cared about doctrine when doctrine decided which general held command and whether his unit would be paid. A noble cared about doctrine when doctrine offered a banner for revolt. Underneath all of it sat the central question of survival. The Eastern Empire had lost the Western provinces and still had to feed its capital, pay its troops, and control its officials. It did that through systems that rewarded competence and punished disorder. It also did it through methods that look cold on the page. The empire deployed violence with paperwork attached. It punished rebels. It confiscated property. It exiled clergy. It blinded opponents in later centuries. The habit of harsh enforcement took root early. It grew in a world where delay could kill a dynasty. Anastasius grew old in the palace he had guarded through riots and revolts. He spent his final years surrounded by eunuchs, advisors, and guards, with petitions arriving every day. Some petitions asked for tax relief. Some asked for a judge to intervene in a property dispute. Some asked for a pardon. Each request had a name, a place, and a seal. The empire lived in those details. Outside, the city remained bright in the sun and harsh in winter. People walked over stone streets and carried water in jars. They prayed in churches filled with smoke from lamps. They watched races in the hippodrome and argued about drivers and colors. They waited for ships carrying grain. They watched foreign ambassadors file into the city in embroidered clothing and measured the gifts they brought. Constantinople still functioned as a capital because it stayed central to trade, law, and command. Even with danger on every edge, the city offered safety that drew people in. In 518, Anastasius died. The palace did not fall into immediate chaos. Guards secured the doors. Officials gathered. The question of succession rose again, urgent and practical. The man who emerged as emperor was Justin, an older soldier of humble origins who had risen through the guard. He understood the army. He understood what a pay chest meant to loyalty. He also had a nephew named Justinian who watched closely, learned quickly, and kept his own counsel. In the corridors of the palace, men spoke of continuity and stability. In the barracks, soldiers listened for news of bonuses and commands. In the churches, clergy listened for signs of doctrinal change. The Eastern Roman Empire moved into its next phase with the same tools it had used to survive the West's collapse: gold, walls, paperwork, ruthless choices made in quiet rooms. A clerk laid a stack of petitions on a table in the great palace and placed a fresh sheet of parchment on top. He dipped his pen, wrote a date, then paused as footsteps sounded in the corridor. Justinian entered with 2 guards behind him and a small group of advisors at his shoulder. He moved past the table without looking at the petitions. He walked straight to a map laid out on a second table, weighted at the corners with bronze ink pots. The map showed coastlines and ports, the Adriatic, North Africa, and the long curve of the eastern frontier. Justinian pointed to Italy with 2 fingers and asked for a report. A general answered in short phrases about ships, provisions, and the state of the troops in the Balkans. Another man spoke about the treasury. Justinian listened and asked for numbers. He kept his voice low. He used simple words. He carried himself like a man who expected obedience. In the doorway behind him, Empress Theodora arrived and stood with her hands folded, watching the men in the room. Her jewelry caught the light from the oil lamps. Her face stayed still. The room adjusted itself around her, as if the men had learned which conversations belonged in front of her and which belonged somewhere else. Justinian ruled through paperwork and fear, and he made those tools look like order. He wanted the old Roman territories back under his authority, and he wanted them to pay taxes into his treasury. He wanted the sea lanes secure for merchants who carried grain and oil and the kind of luxury goods that made courtiers smile. He also wanted the emperor's name spoken with respect in places that now belonged to kings. He sent agents with letters and gifts. He sent officers to inspect units and replace commanders. He sent tax collectors into provinces where people already complained about taxes. He also watched the church with the same careful focus he gave to the army. Priests and bishops held real power in cities. They controlled crowds. They carried the loyalty of neighborhoods. Justinian met with them in rooms that smelled of incense and wax, and he spoke to them with the calm tone of a man asking for cooperation. He expected compliance. When he did not get it, he used exile, imprisonment, and confiscation. Theodora watched those decisions too. She had grown up close to crowds and close to violence. As a young woman, she had worked in the theater and in the circus world, with performers who had to smile under shouting and thrown objects. In the palace, she brought that same awareness of mood and danger. She read faces quickly. She remembered names. She kept her own network of supporters, including clergy and court officials, who owed their position to her approval. In January of 532, the city broke open. The racing factions in the Hippodrome, the Blues and the Greens, had turned their rivalries into politics, and their politics into street fighting. Men carried clubs and knives. They attacked each other in alleys and then disappeared into the crowds. Some were arrested, some were sentenced. 2 condemned men survived a botched execution and took refuge in a church. The factions demanded mercy for them. Justinian refused and then wavered, and the crowd treated that wavering as weakness. On the day of races, the stands filled with shouting. The emperor sat in his box above the track with guards close by. The chanting began as a demand, then became an insult, then became a threat. Nika, conquer. The word rolled through the Hippodrome, while the emperor's officials watched the mass of bodies below. Within hours, the crowd spilled into the streets. Fires started. Smoke rose over the city. The rioters targeted symbols of authority. They burned buildings, including the Church of Hagia Sophia, and the flames spread to nearby structures. Men dragged furniture into the streets and broke it for fuel. A group stormed the prison and freed inmates who joined the chaos. Another group shouted the name of a rival claimant to the throne and moved through the city like a marching column, picking up more men as they went. Justinian retreated into the palace complex while the noise grew louder outside the gates. Inside, advisors argued in tight voices. Some urged flight to the harbor, where a ship could carry the emperor across the Bosporus. Justinian listened. He looked tired. Theodora stepped forward and spoke in a flat, direct voice that left little room for debate. She said she would stay. She said she would face whatever happened inside the city. Her words held the room because everyone understood the alternative. Flight meant civil war and a likely death later. Justinian gave orders. Belisarius and Mundus gathered troops, including guards and loyal soldiers. They prepared an attack through the entrances of the Hippodrome, while the crowd below still believed it held power. The soldiers entered and moved down the aisles in tight formation. They killed men where they sat. They killed men who tried to climb over the walls. They killed men who ran toward the exits. By the end of the day, the track and stands held bodies and blood and broken benches. Justinian kept the throne. The city counted its dead. People walked through burned streets the next morning and stepped over charred beams and fallen tiles. Merchants opened shops with smoke stains still on the shutters. Men in authority walked with escorts. Everyone learned the limits of public anger. Justinian treated the destruction as a chance to rebuild the city in a way that advertised control. He ordered a new Hagia Sophia to rise where the burned church had stood. He hired Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus, men who understood geometry and materials, and he gave them money and labor. Work crews arrived from across the empire. They hauled stone blocks and mixed mortar. They brought marble columns from older temples and buildings. Ships unloaded loads of brick and timber. Foremen shouted orders. Engineers measured and remeasured. The building site stayed loud from dawn to dusk. Justinian visited. He watched the dome take shape as masons laid brick in curved courses. He stood with officials as gold and glass mosaics were carried inside. He also ordered a legal project that mattered as much as any church. He put Tribonian in charge of a commission to collect and organize centuries of Roman law. Scribes copied old texts in rooms filled with the smell of ink and scraped parchment. They argued over wording. They compared versions and crossed out lines. They produced volumes that could be cited in court, used by administrators, and taught to students. Justinian expected the law to carry his authority into places he would never see. A governor in Syria could enforce a contract under Justinian's code. A judge in Egypt could decide a dispute using the same principles. The empire gained a tool that worked quietly, then worked again the next day and the next. War remained the main act. Justinian watched the Western kingdoms with interest and patience. North Africa had once been Rome's breadbasket and now belonged to the Vandals, a ruling class with its own court and its own churches, and a fleet that threatened sea trade. Italy belonged to the Ostrogoths, who kept Roman administration in place while they held military power. Justinian saw opportunity. He built a case for intervention through a mix of diplomacy and legal claims. When the moment came, he gave the order. In 533, Belisarius sailed with a fleet and an army across the sea toward Africa. The ships carried soldiers, horses, weapons, and barrels of water. They carried spare rigging and grain. They carried scribes who kept lists and officers who enforced discipline. Belisarius landed near Caput Vada and marched along the coast toward Carthage. The Vandal king Gelimer moved to meet him. The first major clash came near a place called Ad Decimum. The fighting stayed confused, with units losing contact and commanders trying to gather men while dust rose and men shouted. Belisarius kept control long enough to take advantage of Vandal mistakes. His troops pushed through and the Vandals retreated. Belisarius entered Carthage and ordered his men to stay disciplined. He posted guards. He punished looting. He understood that a city could turn against an occupier fast when soldiers acted like thieves. The next battle at Tricamarum broke the Vandal army. Gelimer fled and then surrendered. He was brought to Constantinople later and marched in a triumph, a captive king walking under guard while crowds watched from the streets. Justinian gained Africa and the tax revenue that came with it. He also gained a model for conquest. Use a skilled commander, keep discipline, move fast, present the outcome as restoration. Italy took longer and cost more. The first moves looked easy. Belisarius took Sicily, then crossed to the mainland, took Naples after a hard siege, and entered Rome. The city of Rome still carried symbolic value, and Justinian wanted it under his name. The Gothic court responded with force. They besieged Rome. Belisarius held the walls, repaired breaches, and ran supplies into the city under pressure. The fighting dragged on through months of hunger and disease and constant skirmishes outside the gates. People in Rome died of wounds and sickness. Animals died too. The streets filled with the smell of refuse. When the siege lifted, the war continued in marches and counter-marches across a devastated countryside. Justinian ordered reinforcements and demanded results. He also watched another front. In 540, the Persian king Khosrow crossed the frontier and took Antioch, one of the great cities of the east. Persian troops looted and carried captives away. Justinian faced a decision. He had poured resources into Italy, and now his eastern provinces faced direct attack. He negotiated with Khosrow, using payments to buy time, then tried to manage both wars at once. That balance depended on money, and the money came from taxes. Tax collectors pushed harder. Officials looked for arrears. Villages that had survived earlier conflicts now faced demands backed by soldiers. People paid when they could. People hid grain when they could. People bribed officials when they could. In 541 and 542, another disaster arrived by ship. The first cases appeared in the capital, then spread. People developed fever. Some developed swellings in the groin or under the arm. Many died within days. The city's normal routines fell apart. Families stayed indoors. Workers abandoned jobs. Corpses lay in houses because relatives feared touching them. The government tried to respond. Officials organized burial teams. They dug pits and filled them fast. They used carts to carry bodies. They recruited men with payments and threats. Priests performed rites over rows of dead with little time between prayers. Justinian himself fell ill. Guards restricted access to the palace rooms. Advisors waited in corridors for news. Theodora remained present and alert, speaking to officials, keeping the chain of command working. Justinian survived. Many of the city did not. When the deaths slowed, Constantinople remained scarred. Some shops never reopened. Some neighborhoods lost whole households. The state still demanded taxes, and the population had shrunk. That mismatch created pressure that never fully eased. The later years of Justinian's reign carried both victories and consequences. In Italy, the Gothic War revived under a capable leader named Totila, who retook cities and threatened Roman positions. Justinian recalled Belisarius, then sent him again, then replaced him, chasing outcomes with commanders as if changing a man could change the structure of the problem. Finally, he sent Narses with a larger force and a clear mandate. Narses moved with care, secured routes, and met the Goths in major battles. The last resistance collapsed, and Justinian could claim Italy as imperial territory. The claim looked clean on a map. The ground looked different. Many cities sat damaged. Farms lay abandoned. Roads had grown unsafe. The state still needed revenue and recruits. Justinian also faced problems closer to the capital. Slavs and other groups pushed into the Balkans, raiding and taking captives. Fortresses needed repairs. Garrisons needed pay. The emperor sat in his palace and issued orders, and each order required money and men to carry it out. Theodora died in 548, and Justinian continued without her, older and more solitary, surrounded by officials who watched his moods and tried to guess his next demand. He attended ceremonies in Hagia Sophia under the great dome he had ordered built. He listened to choirs. He watched candles flicker in rows. He left the church and returned to the palace and read reports about casualties, shipments, and disputes. The empire under Justinian looked immense and controlled from the capital, and it also depended on constant pressure applied from the top. When he died in 565, the treasury had been drained by war and rebuilding. The population had suffered from plague, and the borders required more soldiers than the state could comfortably supply. His successors inherited restored territories and a set of bills that never stopped arriving. The man who carried the news of Justinian's death walked through the palace corridors with a folded strip of parchment held against his chest. Guards at the doorway glanced at the seal and stepped aside. Inside, Justin II stood near a window looking out over tiled roofs and the line of the seawalls beyond. He turned when the courier entered, took the message, read it, and handed it to a court official without a word. A few minutes later, servants brought in wax tablets, ink, and clean parchment. A clerk sharpened a reed pen with a small knife and waited for the first dictated order. Justinian had left behind marble and law books and a long list of enemies who measured the empire by its weakest border. Justin II inherited all of it in one morning. The empire still had Italy on paper, Africa on paper, and parts of Spain on paper. The empire also had empty rooms where tax records used to be neat and predictable. Men at the treasury office opened chests, counted coin, and wrote totals in columns. The totals failed to match the needs of the army. The army already knew. Soldiers had families in the city. Soldiers talked in taverns. Soldiers listened to rumors the way sailors listened to weather. Within a few years, the map began to change again, this time in ways that made the conquests look like a gamble that had come due. In 568, Lombard war bands crossed into Italy. They came on foot and horseback with weapons and supplies, with families and priests and wagons. They took towns that could not pay garrisons. They took fields that could not grow crops during siege. Byzantine officials in Ravenna sent letters to Constantinople asking for money and troops. The letters arrived. They were read. Replies went out with careful language and thin promises. Ships carried some reinforcements, then carried fewer. Commanders in Italy held a few coastal cities and a corridor of territory, and they watched the interior slip away. In the Balkans, Avar riders and Slavic raiders crossed rivers, burned villages, and carried people off in ropes. Imperial officers tried to gather forces to stop them. Those forces cost money. The treasury remained tight. Justin II made choices that looked confident in ceremonies and looked panicked in private meetings. He stopped paying subsidies to Persia, then faced the Persian army across the frontier. He demanded results from generals who worked with undermanned units. He argued with advisors. He shouted. He lost sleep. The people around him adjusted their tone and watched his face for signs of anger. The empire moved forward under a ruler who needed calm and gave the opposite. When his behavior grew erratic, his wife, Sophia, and senior officials pushed him aside and elevated a general named Tiberius to carry the work. This was a palace solution, quick and practical, with legal wording to make it look clean. The borders did not care about legal wording. Maurice, who followed Tiberius, tried to run the state like a man balancing ledgers. He fought on multiple fronts. He pushed back against Persia in the east. He tried to stop raids in the Balkans. He issued orders about supply and discipline. He expected the army to endure hardship in the field to reduce costs. Soldiers slept in wet camps and ate thin rations and listened to commanders speak about savings. When a ruler starts treating soldiers like numbers, soldiers start treating the ruler like a target. In 602, Maurice ordered troops on the Danube to spend the winter beyond the river to save money on supplies. The order reached the camps. Men sat around fires and argued. Officers tried to enforce the command. The army refused. The mutiny spread fast. The troops chose a leader, a centurion named Phocas, and marched toward Constantinople. Maurice tried to respond with palace measures. He sent messages and tried to negotiate. He tried to secure the city. The attempt failed. Phocas entered the capital with soldiers at his back and took the throne. Maurice fled with his family across the water to Chalcedon. Phocas sent men after him. They caught Maurice and brought him back under guard. Maurice stood on a shore or a dock, close enough to smell salt and tar, and watched as his sons were brought out and killed in front of him one by one. Then the executioners killed him. Soldiers who had once sworn loyalty stood close and watched. Some looked away. Some stared. Phocas returned to the city and began ruling through intimidation, rewarding allies, punishing rivals, and searching for plots in every corner of the palace. Across the eastern border, the Persian king Khosrow II received reports about the coup and the executions. He had once been helped by Maurice during an earlier Persian civil conflict. He had reasons of policy and reasons of pride. He gathered his commanders and moved. Persian armies crossed into Byzantine territory under a stated goal of restoring order and avenging Maurice. The stated goal looked noble in letters. The movement looked like conquest on the ground. In 603, towns along the frontier fell. In the following years, Persian forces pushed deeper, taking cities that had resisted for centuries. Byzantine generals tried to stop them, while the palace in Constantinople turned inward. Phocas feared conspiracy more than invasion. He replaced commanders, executed suspects, and filled the court with men who said what he wanted to hear. Provinces paid the price. Reports arrived with lists of captured cities, missing units, and refugees flooding roads. The palace read them and stamped them and filed them. The Persians kept marching. In 611, they took Antioch. In 613, they won a major battle near the city and broke Byzantine resistance in the region. In 614, Persian troops entered Jerusalem. They looted churches and carried off treasures. They took the relic known as the True Cross and sent it east as a trophy. Clergy in Constantinople spoke about this in sermons. People in the city listened and crossed themselves, and then asked whether the grain ships would still arrive. The grain ships mattered because the city's population still needed daily bread, and the state still needed order inside the walls. In 619, Persian forces entered Egypt. They took Alexandria. They gained the province that had long supplied grain to the capital. Merchants in Constantinople watched prices rise. Officials at granaries recalculated rations. Soldiers at the gates watched the crowds more carefully. In 610, while the Persian armies advanced, another fleet entered the harbor of Constantinople. Heraclius arrived from Africa with ships and soldiers, backed by the local elite of Carthage, who had decided that Phocas would destroy the empire if he stayed in power. The fleet anchored. Men in armor climbed onto the docks. Crowds gathered. The city guard assessed the situation and chose sides. Inside the palace, Phocas tried to rally support. He failed. Heraclius's supporters seized Phocas, dragged him into a public place, and killed him. The new emperor began his reign with blood in the streets and a problem list that could fill a room. Heraclius held meetings that lasted into the night. He spoke with treasury officials. He spoke with generals. He spoke with clergy, including the patriarch, who held influence over the population and access to church wealth. The conversations produced decisions that sounded extreme and also sounded necessary. The state needed money to pay troops. Heraclius allowed the use of church plate and church funds for the war effort. Clergy cooperated. Officials collected what they could. Workmen melted objects in furnaces and poured metal into forms. Scribes recorded weights and totals. The war shifted from a distant frontier problem to a survival problem. Persian forces stood within reach of the capital's supply lines. The Balkans remained unstable. Avars and Slavs raided up to the long walls outside Constantinople. Heraclius faced the old imperial equation with sharper numbers: pay the army or lose the army. Lose the army and lose the capital. Heraclius made a decision that alarmed many in his court. He chose to take command in person and carry the war to the enemy. He left the city with a field army and marched into Anatolia, moving along roads where villages stood damaged and fields had gone untended. He brought priests and relics to strengthen morale. He brought engineers to repair bridges and manage siege equipment. He brought supply officers who kept track of grain, fodder, and coin. The army moved in disciplined columns when it could, and in scattered groups when terrain forced it. Heraclius learned quickly that this war would be won through marching and wintering and marching again, through negotiation with local leaders, and through controlling the routes that moved food and troops. He aimed at Persian forces when he could. He avoided fights when he needed to preserve men. He also worked through alliances. He communicated with Turkic groups north of the Caucasus and offered payments and status in exchange for pressure on Persia's flanks. His letters traveled by courier across mountains and through hostile areas. Some couriers made it. Some disappeared. The campaign continued anyway. In 626, while Heraclius fought in the east, the capital faced its own crisis. Avars marched toward Constantinople with a large force, bringing siege equipment and allied Slavic boats. Persian troops reached the Asian shore across the Bosporus and waited, unable to cross because the Byzantine navy controlled the water. The city prepared. Gates were secured. The walls were manned. Stores of arrows and stones were moved into place. Women carried water to defenders. Priests walked along sections of wall with icons held high, and soldiers watched them pass. Outside the walls, the Avars attacked. They brought ladders. They tried to breach gates. Slavic boats moved across the water and attempted to land troops. Byzantine forces repelled them with missiles and close combat. Men fought on the ramparts with spears and swords. They pushed ladders away with poles. They threw rocks. They poured burning material onto attackers. The assault continued for days. The city's defenders held. The navy destroyed boats on the water. Without coordination with the Persians across the strait, the Avars could not complete the encirclement. The Avars withdrew. Their retreat left broken equipment and dead men in the ditches. Constantinople remained standing. Inside the city, officials counted remaining supplies and prepared for the next threat. Heraclius pressed harder. In 627, he moved deep into Persian territory with a smaller army, choosing speed and surprise over size. He marched through cold weather, along rough roads, with troops who wrapped cloth around their legs and hands. Scouts rode ahead. They returned with reports of Persian movements. Heraclius's army met a Persian force near Nineveh. The fighting took place on open ground, with visibility limited at times by weather and dust. Units closed and separated and closed again. Soldiers stabbed and hacked at close range. Horses fell. Commanders shouted. Heraclius stayed near the action. He moved with his guards and tried to keep his men focused. The Persians retreated after heavy losses. Heraclius pushed forward and threatened the Persian heartland. Persian nobles turned against their king. Khosrow II was removed and killed. The new Persian leadership opened negotiations. In 628, terms were agreed. Persian forces withdrew from Byzantine territory. Captured cities returned to imperial control. The true cross was returned. Heraclius traveled with it later, bringing it back in a public ceremony. People watched from streets and church doors as clergy carried the relic and the emperor followed, dressed for ritual and display. The empire had survived a war that had reached into its core provinces. It had done so through desperate finance, relentless campaigning, and palace stability after a violent coup. The cost remained visible. Towns lay damaged. Many soldiers were dead. Whole districts in the east had changed hands multiple times. The empire's administration returned to these places and tried to restart tax collection and law courts, as if routine could erase the last 20 years. Then, a new series of reports began arriving from the south. Arab forces, newly united under Islam, moved out of Arabia and into the borderlands. The first raids looked familiar. Border troops had seen raids for centuries. These raids increased in scale and coordination. Commanders in Syria sent requests for reinforcements. Heraclius had little to spare. The army had fought Persia for a generation. Units were under strength. Horses were scarce. The treasury had been stretched by years of emergency measures. In 634 and 635, battles took place across Syria. Cities surrendered after negotiations. Others resisted and were taken. In 636, Byzantine forces gathered near the Yarmouk River to stop the advance. The army included regular troops and allied contingents. The officers argued over deployment. The battle unfolded over several days. The Byzantines faced mobile opponents who used cavalry effectively and maintained pressure. The Byzantine line broke. Soldiers fled. Many died in pursuit or fell into ravines. The defeat opened Syria to further conquest. Heraclius received the news while in the north, and the report would have carried lists of losses, names of commanders, and the short phrases that signaled catastrophe. He traveled back toward the capital and stopped in Antioch. He looked at the city he had once regained and now risked losing again. He ordered evacuations of officials and moved what treasure he could. He withdrew. Jerusalem fell after a siege and negotiation in 637. Egypt followed. Byzantine forces tried to defend the Nile routes and the fortified points, but the province fell in stages. Alexandria surrendered in 642. Grain supplies shifted to new authorities. Constantinople adjusted its supply network again, relying more on Anatolia and the Black Sea. The empire shrank fast. The people in the capital still watched races. The bureaucracy still wrote letters. The palace still held ceremonies. Beyond the walls, the map had changed. Heraclius aged during these years. His hair turned grey. His health deteriorated. He spent more time in rooms where advisors spoke softly and where the smell of medicine mixed with lamp smoke. He had sons by different wives, and factions formed around them. Courtiers watched the succession question the way vultures watch a road. The emperor's victories against Persia remained real, and they also looked distant as new defeats arrived. When he died in 641, the empire retained its capital, its Anatolian heartland, and parts of the Balkans and Italy. It had lost Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, provinces that had fed the treasury and the army. The state reacted through practical measures. It reorganized military districts in Anatolia to support local defense and reduce the cost of long campaigns. It shifted resources toward fleets and fortified positions. It relied on the walls and the navy again. The officials who managed these changes did not speak about destiny. They spoke about rations, recruitment, ships, and pay. The empire had survived the fall of the West, survived plague, survived civil war, survived Persian occupation, and survived the siege of its capital. It now faced a neighbor with momentum and discipline, and it had fewer provinces to fund resistance. The men who ran Constantinople understood the pattern. A crisis arrived. The state narrowed its focus. It spent what it had. It demanded obedience. It lived through another year. The first order went out while the city still smelled of burned pitch from the last attack at sea. A messenger carried it from the palace to the gatehouse guards, then to the harbor offices, then to the clerks who kept lists of church property. Constantinople had survived the siege of 717 and 718 through hard choices and hard weather. Leo, the new emperor, had taken the throne with soldiers at his back and an enemy army outside the walls. Arab troops camped on the landward side with tents and livestock, and their fleet filled the water with sails and oars. The defenders locked the gates and rationed food. Men carried stones to the walls and stacked arrows in bundles. At night, sentries walked the towers with lamps covered by cloth to keep the light low. The navy waited for the right moment and then pushed out with tubes and pumps that sprayed burning liquid onto enemy ships. Wood caught fast. Men jumped into the water. Some sank under armor. Some clung to debris and were picked up later as prisoners. Winter arrived and made the siege worse for the attackers. Animals died. Soldiers shivered in wet clothing. When the Bulgars struck the Arab camp from the north, the attackers faced fighting on ground that had already turned into churned mud. The city endured. When spring came, the enemy withdrew. The streets filled again. Merchants reopened stalls. Priests held Thanksgiving services. Leo listened to the prayers and watched the crowds, and he judged the mood as carefully as he judged a frontier report. He had a battered empire on his hands, and he needed obedience. He also needed an explanation that would hold the public still when the next crisis came. Leo chose the churches. The capital and the provinces were full of images. Christ painted on wood panels, the Virgin on gold backgrounds, saints in mosaics over doors, angels in frescoes above arches. People touched them, people kissed them, people carried them in processions through streets and fields. Some soldiers wore small icons in pouches under their armor. Some sailors nailed them to a mast. Some mothers held them over a child with a fever. Leo looked at these images, and he saw crowds moving under their influence. He saw monks and bishops acting as gatekeepers, deciding which images were holy and which were suspect, deciding who had access and who did not. He also saw an empire that had lost Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, and he saw Arab armies still pressing at the borders. He issued an order that changed daily life in every town with a church. Officials would remove and destroy icons in public worship. Clergy would stop encouraging their veneration. The police and the army would enforce compliance. The message traveled as ink on parchment and as shouted instructions at city gates. In Constantinople, workers climbed ladders to reach an icon above the bronze gate of the palace complex. A crowd gathered and shouted at them. Someone threw a stone. A man on the ladder lost balance and fell. Soldiers moved in with shields and clubs. People ran. Some were caught. Some were dragged away. The next day, the ladder went up again and the image came down. The policy did not move like a clean knife through the empire. It moved like a bar fight that spreads from table to table. In some places, local bishops cooperated and told their congregations to obey. In other places, monks locked church doors and stood in front of the icons with their arms out. In some towns, soldiers arrived, broke the doors, and pulled men aside by their hair. Icons were carried out and burned in courtyards. Wooden panels cracked in the fire. Gold leaf curled and blackened. Smoke rose over neighborhoods where people had prayed for years. The state seized monastic lands and property and redirected income to the treasury and the army. Clerks inventoried silver cups, candlesticks, and reliquaries. They wrote totals on tablets and sealed storerooms. Some bishops lost their seats. Some monks were arrested and sent to prison in chains. Others fled into mountains and lived in caves or small villages where sympathetic families fed them. Leo had supporters who agreed with him and opponents who feared his policies. He used the methods every emperor used. He rewarded loyalty with offices. He punished resistance with exile and property seizures. He also had to keep the army focused, because the army guarded the walls and marched to the frontiers. Any civil dispute that weakened discipline could turn into a disaster at the next battle. The violence on the border did not pause for theology. Arab forces tested the eastern defenses year after year, probing for weakness along mountain passes and open plains. In the Balkans, Slavic groups settled in abandoned areas and raided when opportunity appeared. The state responded by reorganizing its remaining resources into military districts. Farmers in Anatolia were tied to land and service obligations. Officers in these districts managed local defense and provided troops when the emperor called. Men who had once traveled far with expeditionary armies now guarded valleys near their homes. The system improved survival. It also gave local commanders more power and made internal politics sharper. An emperor needed the loyalty of these commanders and the loyalty of their soldiers. Leo worked the system with care and suspicion. He chose reliable men. He watched for ambition. He also raised his son Constantine to inherit the job with a hard education in violence and administration. When Constantine V took power, he treated the conflict over images as a problem that needed a decisive solution. He also treated it as a test of authority. In 741, a rival named Artabazdos seized Constantinople for a time and presented himself as a protector of icons. His supporters held sections of the city and used the church as a base. Constantine gathered loyal troops, marched back, and took the city after fighting in streets and at gates. When he regained the palace, he punished the losers in public. He had Artabasdos blinded. He exiled or executed leaders. He moved fast to restore control of the guard units. Then he went after the institutions that backed his enemies. He targeted monasteries and the monks who opposed his icon policy. Some monasteries were closed. Some were converted to barracks or warehouses. Some monks were forced to sign statements of compliance. Others were paraded through the city as a warning. Constantine held a council in 754 at Hieria, across the water from Constantinople, and pushed through official condemnations of icon veneration. Bishops signed the decrees. Scribes copied them. Couriers carried them to provincial centers. Churches were instructed to remove images and replace them with crosses or simple decoration. Some artisans who made icons lost their livelihood and found other work. Some continued in secret, painting small panels that could be hidden under clothing or stored in a jar. Constantine also fought. His wars mattered because they proved his legitimacy to the army. He campaigned against Arab forces in Anatolia, raiding and counter-raiding along the frontier. He campaigned against the Bulgars in the north, leading troops through passes and across rivers. He built and rebuilt fortifications. He moved populations to strengthen strategic areas, relocating families from one region to another under guard. A family could wake up in a village near the coast and be told to pack what they could carry and march inland to a new settlement. The state issued orders and enforced them with soldiers. That kind of control kept the empire from collapsing. It also created anger that simmered for decades. Constantine died in 775 after years of these efforts. The empire remained intact, the border still held. The internal conflict over images remained unfinished, and it waited for a ruler who needed a different coalition. Irene arrived at the center of power through marriage, then stayed there through force and patience. She came from Athens and learned palace politics fast. After her husband Leo IV died, She served as regent for their son Constantine VI, who was still young. Irene met with ministers and generals and bishops. She listened to reports about the army and about factions in the city. She also met with icon supporters and used their networks. In 787, she convened a council at Nicaea and restored the veneration of icons as official policy. Church interiors changed again. Painters and mosaic workers returned to work. Images of Christ and saints reappeared on walls and panels. People who had hidden icons brought them out. Priests held ceremonies to reinstall them. Irene gained support from many clergy and many urban residents. She also faced a serious problem. Her son grew older and wanted real power. The army watched him. Some generals preferred a male ruler who led campaigns in person. Court officials shifted their loyalties as they usually did. Irene treated the problem like a threat to her survival. In 797, she ordered her son seized. Guards took him into custody inside the palace complex. They blinded him. He did not recover. Irene ruled alone afterward, surrounded by advisors who praised her in public and calculated their chances in private. In the West, the consequences arrived with ceremony and steel. Rome had its own bishop, its own political needs, and its own security fears. The Pope depended on local allies and faced pressure from Lombards and other powers in Italy. He also watched Constantinople from a distance and judged legitimacy through both theology and politics. Irene ruled as sole emperor. Western leaders treated that fact as an opening. In 800, on Christmas Day, the Pope crowned Charlemagne as emperor in Rome. The act took place in a church filled with clergy and armed men. The crown was placed on Charlemagne's head in front of the altar. People shouted acclamations. The message was blunt. The West would claim an imperial title again under a Frankish king. The claim created competition. It also deepened distrust between Greek and Latin elites. Constantinople still had power and wealth, and it still held the language of Roman law and administration. It now faced a Western court that presented itself as a rival source of imperial authority. Diplomacy continued. Envoys traveled, gifts were exchanged. Letters were written in careful phrases that concealed contempt behind honorifics. The conflict over icons returned again in the 9th century because emperors kept changing, and each new ruler needed a base of support. Leo V took the throne in 813 after military defeats and political turmoil. He faced pressure from an army that wanted order and victories. He also faced religious factions that used the icon issue as a rallying point. Leo reopened iconoclast policies. Officials returned to churches and removed images again. Bishops who supported icons were deposed. Monks were arrested. Some were beaten. Some were exiled to remote islands where guards could watch them and where escape required a boat. The state used prisons. The state used confiscations. The state used the same file, keeping it used for taxes and troop rolls. A person could lose a monastery and see the loss recorded in clean handwriting. Under Michael II and then Theophilus, the enforcement continued in varying intensity. Theophilus took a personal interest. He held hearings. He ordered punishments. He used ridicule as well as force, turning public humiliation into a weapon. He also fought against Arab forces and tried to maintain the frontier defense. He needed the army. He needed revenue. He needed unity in the capital. The icon conflict made unity difficult, and Theophilus treated opposition as a security threat. When Theophilus died in 842, his widow Theodora became regent for their young son Michael III. She held the palace in her hands the way Irene had, with a close circle of advisors and with careful control of appointments. Theodora chose to end the conflict in a way that favored icons and the clergy who supported them. In 843, she restored the veneration of icons and made the change public and permanent. A procession moved through Constantinople, with icons carried high. Clergy walked in vestments. Officials walked with them. Soldiers guarded the route. Crowds lined the streets. People reached out to touch the panels as they passed. The government issued proclamations. Churches restored images again. The city's walls stayed the same, and the sea stayed the same. And inside the city, the official picture of holiness returned to painted faces and gold backgrounds. Theodora used the decision to strengthen her coalition and stabilize the regency. She also knew that the empire had no spare energy for endless internal war. The treasury needed predictable revenue. The army needed predictable pay. The border needed attention. The icon struggle had consumed decades, and many people were tired of it in a practical way. A shopkeeper wanted customers. A farmer wanted a harvest. A soldier wanted boots and rations. The wit in this period sits in the paperwork. An emperor could change doctrine and still demand that tax collectors deliver the same totals. A bishop could denounce images in the morning and request an exemption for church lands in the afternoon. A general could shout slogans about faith and then negotiate a marriage alliance with the same families he accused of heresy last year. The empire stayed alive through these contradictions because its institutions kept functioning. Clerks wrote. Judges held court. Shipmasters loaded cargo. Soldiers stood on walls and marched when ordered. The emperors used religion as a lever because it moved people, and it also exposed how dangerous people could be when moved. The War of Images ended in official terms in 843, and the memory stayed. It stayed in scars on monastery doors, in missing mosaics that were never replaced, in family stories about a grandfather who went into exile, in the long habit of viewing the palace as a place where doctrine could change with a new ruler. The empire walked forward into the next century with its icons restored, its rivals multiplying, and its borders still contested by men who cared very little about what hung on a church wall. A bronze seal hit a wooden table in a provincial office at Adrianople, and the clerk flinched as if the metal had struck his knuckles. The messenger who delivered it stood with dust on his boots and a torn strap on his satchel. He had come from Constantinople. The wax tablet he carried bore orders about land, soldiers, and taxes, written in a neat hand that meant someone in the capital expected obedience without discussion. The clerk read the lines, then called for an assistant to pull the registers from a shelf. The registers smelled of old ink and smoke from lamps. Names filled the pages in tight columns. Fields, vineyards, oxen, household counts. A soldier's service obligation sat beside a farmer's acreage, as if the state could measure both with the same ruler. Outside the office, men in wool tunics hauled sacks of grain toward a storehouse under guard. The empire was rebuilding its strength in ways that looked dull from a distance and felt sharp up close. Every sack of grain meant food for a garrison. Every garrison meant a gate kept shut at the right moment. Every line in a register meant a claim backed by armed men. In Constantinople, the palace corridors filled each morning with officials carrying tablets and bundles of parchment. Eunuchs moved between doors with keys on their belts. Generals waited in antechambers with helmets under their arms. Bishops arrived with attendants and incense on their clothing. The Macedonian dynasty held the throne, and the city ran with a confidence that showed in small details, in fresh plaster on walls, in patrols that kept markets orderly, in the steady arrival of ships that brought grain and oil. The empire had survived the long century of losses, and it had adapted. Military districts in Anatolia provided troops who lived near their assigned land, men who could be summoned without dragging an army across half the world. Fortresses guarded passes. Fleets guarded the straits and the sea lanes that fed the capital. The court also used diplomacy as a weapon. Envoys traveled with gifts and letters written in careful Greek, promising friendship while aiming to separate enemies from allies. In these years, foreigners arrived in Constantinople and stared openly. They saw the walls, the harbors, the domes, and the gold. They saw disciplined guards at gates. They saw officials who understood paperwork, and they saw a city that looked expensive to attack. The wars in the east continued, and the victories began to accumulate. Arab emirates held strong points across the frontier and sent raiders into Anatolia for plunder and captives. Byzantine commanders responded with counter-raids that burned farms and seized livestock. Prisoners were marched back under guard and sold or exchanged. In the capital, captives sometimes appeared in triumphal processions, walking behind a general while the crowd watched and shouted. Some crowds threw fruit, some threw stones. The empire also rebuilt its position at sea. Crete, held by Muslim forces who used it as a base for piracy, became a bleeding wound for Byzantine trade. Merchant ships vanished. Coastal villages woke to screams and smoke. The court listened to reports and finally committed to a full operation. In 960, the general Nikephoros Phocas led a large expedition against Crete. The fleet carried siege engines, timber, and bags of nails, along with soldiers who knew they might die on an island far from home. They landed, marched toward the main fortress at Chandax, and began a siege that dragged on through months. Men dug trenches, men built ramps. Engineers measured distances. Archers fired from behind screens. Night attacks happened when the defenders tried to burn siege works. The attackers answered with buckets of water and sand. When the walls finally broke, soldiers poured into the city. Blood ran through streets that had been defended with desperation. The capture of Crete removed a threat and reopened the sea. It also proved something to the empire's enemies. Constantinople could still plan, fund, and execute a major campaign. Nikephoros Phocas rose higher. He became emperor in 963 after the death of Romanos II, and he entered the palace with the manner of a man used to giving orders in a camp. He wore military clothing more often than court robes. He slept little. He listened to reports while eating, his eyes scanning a page as his hand tore bread. He kept pushing armies east. His troops took Cilicia. They pressed into northern Syria. They seized cities through assault and negotiation. The empire regained ground that had been lost for centuries. This resurgence had a cost that showed in the faces of soldiers who returned missing fingers or with scars across the cheek. It also showed in the villages that paid for the war in grain and sons. Nikephoros depended on the army and on a small circle of advisors. He also depended on a woman who sat at the center of court intrigue. Empress Theophano, the widow of Romanos II, stayed close to power. She had married Nikephoros to secure her position. She watched his austerity and his suspicion. She also watched another man, John Tzimiskes, a talented general with charm and ambition. Courtiers whispered. Servants listened at doors. One night in December 969, conspirators entered the palace through a passage known to insiders. They moved through dark corridors, past sleeping guards, and reached the emperor's room. Nikephoros woke to footsteps and raised his hands. The attackers killed him on the floor. In the morning, John Tzimiskes stood in court robes and claimed the throne, while Theophano was sent away into exile. The palace cleaned the blood and returned to routine within days. This was Byzantine politics at its most efficient. A ruler died. The state continued. John Tzimiskes fought like a man who knew his legitimacy rested on results. He campaigned in the east and won victories that allowed him to enter conquered cities with processions and public prayers. He also faced trouble from the north. The Rus, a people who traveled by river and sea with long boats, had entered the Black Sea and pressed into the Balkans. Their leaders saw opportunity in Bulgarian territory and in imperial weakness. They came with axes, spears, and a brutal willingness to take what they wanted. Byzantine officials gathered intelligence through merchants and scouts. Messages arrived in the palace with names of towns attacked and numbers of captives taken. John responded with a campaign that involved marches through muddy roads and battles near fortified points. His troops pushed the Rus back, fought them at close range, and forced their leaders into negotiations. The empire used a familiar method afterward. It offered gifts and agreements that redirected the danger away from Constantinople. The court understood that a battle could end a raid and a treaty could redirect a decade. By the time Basil II emerged as the central ruler, the empire looked strong and also dangerously dependent on capable leadership. Basil became emperor as a young man, and older officials attempted to control him. Basil watched. He learned the faces of those who spoke in court. He learned which men controlled troops, which men controlled money, which men controlled access to him. Two powerful generals, Bardas Skleros and Bardas Phokas, rose in rebellion at different times, backed by armies and by networks of aristocratic families who had grown rich on provincial land. Basil responded with patience and brutality. He built coalitions, used rivalries, and hired allies when needed. At one point, he reached out to the ruler of the Rus and offered a deal that brought foreign soldiers into imperial service. The men arrived as tall guards with heavy weapons and a direct manner, the kind of men who could hold a corridor while courtiers panicked. Basil used them. He also used the war to reshape the balance of power inside the empire. Each rebellion gave him a reason to break estates, confiscate property, and reduce the independence of powerful families. He issued laws aimed at keeping smallholders from losing land to magnates, because smallholders provided taxes and soldiers. A landowner who swallowed villages also swallowed recruits. Basil understood that. His policies had sharp edges. A family could lose land with a stroke of a pen and a squad of soldiers at the door. Basil chose Bulgaria as the central battlefield of his reign. The Bulgarian state under Tsar Samuel controlled mountains, passes, and fortresses that blocked Byzantine movement in the Balkans. Bulgarian raiders struck into imperial territory, burned villages, and took captives. The Danube frontier remained active with other threats as well, but Bulgaria stood closest and hurt most consistently. Basil took this personally and pursued the war year after year. He did not treat it as a seasonal campaign for loot. He treated it as an elimination project. He marched in spring and summer. He marched in autumn. He built roads and repaired bridges. He hauled siege equipment through passes that forced men to move single file. He camped in rain. He slept in a tent with guards outside. He ate what the army ate. When his troops suffered setbacks, he punished commanders and replaced them. When towns resisted, he besieged them. He cut supply lines. He waited while hunger did the work. The war filled the ledgers with expenses and filled graveyards with dead men. The decisive moment came in 1014 at the pass of Clydian. Samuel had fortified the route with earthworks and wooden barriers, positioned to block Basil's advance. The Byzantine army arrived and assessed the defenses. Engineers examined the ground. Officers argued about routes. Basil ordered attacks that failed at first and cost lives. Then a detachment found a path around the Bulgarian position, a route through rough terrain that required effort and silence. The flanking force emerged behind Samuel's line and attacked. The Bulgarian defenders collapsed under pressure from front and rear. Men dropped shields and ran. Others fought and died where they stood. Basil's troops captured thousands. The aftermath revealed Basil's approach to war as governance. He ordered the prisoners divided into groups and blinded, leaving one man in each group with one eye to guide the rest. Soldiers carried out the work with knives and hot irons. The blinded men stumbled, bled, and cried out. They were marched back toward Bulgaria. When Samuel saw his troops return in that condition, he suffered a collapse and died soon after. Basil continued. He took fortress after fortress. He accepted surrenders. He relocated populations. He appointed administrators. By 1018, Bulgaria fell under imperial control. Basil entered the region as ruler. He issued orders about taxes and church organization. The empire gained territory, recruits, and a secure northern frontier. Basil also gained a reputation that traveled. People spoke of him with fear in regions that had resisted. People in Constantinople spoke of him with relief because the long war had ended in victory. Life in the capital during Basil's reign held a strange mix of celebration and menace. The city hosted ceremonies with banners and choirs while the army killed and marched beyond the horizon. In the palace, diplomats from distant lands waited for audiences. They brought gifts. They presented letters. They watched court ritual with a mixture of awe and calculation. Basil used these audiences to shape foreign perceptions. He kept them waiting when he wanted to assert dominance. He gave lavish gifts when he wanted to buy peace. He also kept his own nobles on a short leash. Powerful families learned caution. They spoke carefully. They married into the right circles. They avoided open displays of ambition. Eunuchs and officials in Basil's service gained influence because they depended on the emperor and had fewer independent power bases. Basil preferred that. He trusted men who needed him. He also preferred results over charm. Courtiers who expected warmth found a ruler who gave orders and left the room. Basil's military success rested on a state that could feed armies and move money. Tax collection continued with intensity. Officials inspected villages and assessed obligations. Farmers paid in coin or in kind. When they could not pay, they faced penalties that might include seizure of property. The state kept storage facilities for grain and equipment. It maintained arsenals. It maintained shipyards. Constantinople's harbor remained crowded. Ships arrived with timber, grain, and luxury goods. Foreign merchants paid fees and negotiated with officials. The city stayed rich enough to support large construction and elaborate ritual. Churches were maintained. Monasteries held property. Artisans produced icons, jewelry, and fine textiles. Scholars copied manuscripts. This cultural activity did not require grand speeches. It required stability, patronage, and a market. Basil's victories contributed to that stability. His harsh, internal control also contributed. People could predict the rules even when they disliked them. When Basil II died in 1025, the empire stood larger and stronger than it had in centuries. The treasury held reserves. The army held experienced troops. The borders in the Balkans looked secure. The eastern frontier remained active, but the empire had leverage and depth. Basil left no son. His brother Constantine VIII succeeded him, a man who enjoyed court life and relied on advisors. Court politics shifted. Officials sought access. Aristocratic families sensed opportunity. The discipline Basil enforced began to soften in places where enforcement depended on his personal attention. Constantine VIII had daughters and arranged marriages that would shape the next period. The palace filled with talk of alliances, dowries, and appointments. Generals watched these changes and calculated their prospects. The army still existed, still trained, still capable. The enemy states beyond the frontier also existed, still patient, still watching. The empire had reached a peak, built on constant work and constant force. That peak stood on human decisions, and the next set of decisions would determine whether the structure held. A messenger rode through the Anatolian rain with a leather satchel bouncing against his hip and a crumpled report pressed flat under his belt. He had crossed villages where roofs sagged and fields lay thin from years of raids. He reached the first major garrison and found men cleaning mud from their boots and drying bowstrings near smoky fires. The officer on duty read the report by lamplight, then sent it onward with a fresh seal. The message climbed the chain of command the way a fever moves through a household. By the time it reached Constantinople, the ink on the page described a disaster that even seasoned officials struggled to fit into routine. The Eastern Army had been crushed near Manzikert. The Emperor, Romanos IV Diogenes, had been captured. Soldiers had scattered. Commanders had fled. Towns on the frontier began closing their gates and sending their own messengers to beg for help. In the palace, clerks copied the report into registers and attached it to earlier warnings that had been ignored or postponed. A court official carried the file into a chamber where ministers waited with tight faces and dry mouths. They asked the same questions every regime asks after a battlefield collapse. How many survivors? Which units remain? Which fortresses can still hold? How fast does the enemy move? No one in that room could answer with confidence. The Seljuk Turks did not need to conquer every city by assault. They moved into Anatolia through routes opened by panic and political paralysis. Some towns negotiated. Some surrendered. Some were abandoned by imperial troops who had lost pay and leadership. Nomad groups followed with herds and tents, taking pasture land and settling where the land suited them. Byzantine landholders fled west, carrying keys and icons, and what coin they could hide in cloth. Monasteries received refugees and wrote lists of donations promised in exchange for shelter. Tax records became fiction in districts where the state no longer collected. The army that Basil II had kept tight and disciplined had changed in the decades after his death. Court factions replaced competent commanders. Aristocratic families bought influence. Soldiers served shorter terms or avoided service through payments. The treasury bled through court spending and through the habit of solving problems with gifts. In Constantinople, officials still wore silk and still held ceremonies, and outside the walls, men with bows and light cavalry moved across the plateau that had once supplied the empire with recruits and grain. The palace responded with the weapons it knew best: intrigue, marriage, titles, and lawsuits dressed as policy. Romanos IV returned from captivity and found his throne taken by rivals. He was captured again, this time by his own people, and they blinded him. The empire moved forward under the Ducas family, then staggered under a series of rulers who spent more energy on court survival than on frontier defense. In the streets, people still bought bread and fish and wine. In the corridors, ministers still filed papers. The state still existed. The state had lost its grip on the ground that mattered. Anatolia was the heartland, filled with towns and farmland and soldiers. Losing it did not look dramatic in a single day in the capital. It looked dramatic in 100 small reports that arrived too late and were answered with too little. In 1081, a new man entered the palace with a soldier's posture and a hungry stare. Alexios Komnenos took the throne after moving through the capital with support from troops and from powerful relatives. He did not pretend the situation was stable. He treated the empire as a body on a table that required immediate surgery with rough instruments. The Normans pressed from the west, led by Robert Guiscard, men in mail and helmets who fought with discipline and came with claims to imperial legitimacy through marriage ties. The Pechenegs and other groups threatened the Balkans. The Turks held much of Anatolia. Alexios needed money, troops, and allies. He started by stripping the palace of illusions. He gathered his family into key positions. He used his mother and wife as political operators, assigning them tasks that involved bribes, appointments, and negotiations with the church. He also looked at the treasury and made decisions that would have offended earlier emperors who still believed in limitless grandeur. He debased coinage and then attempted reforms. He seized church valuables for war funding through agreements that were written and signed under pressure. He issued tax demands and enforced them with officers who had swords at their belts. People complied because the alternative involved prison, confiscation, and hunger. Alexios also did something that would reshape the Mediterranean. He asked the West for help. He sent envoys to the Pope and to Western courts, asking for mercenaries and assistance against the Turks. The request traveled through a world that had its own ambitions. When Western leaders heard about Jerusalem and the Holy Land, they heard opportunity. A pope could call for an armed pilgrimage and gain authority. A knight could gain land and status. A younger son could gain a future. The response arrived in waves. The first groups that reached Byzantine territory included poorly organized bands who looted as they marched. Alexios responded with a mix of hospitality and control. He fed them when possible. He pushed them across the Bosporus quickly. He stationed troops to limit damage. When the main crusader leaders arrived, men with titles and armed retinues, Alexios received them in formal audiences and asked them to swear oaths. He wanted captured territory returned to imperial control. He wanted cooperation. The crusader leaders swore because they needed supplies and passage, and because the gold and ceremony of Constantinople impressed them. The oaths did not create trust. They created a temporary contract. The First Crusade fought through Anatolia and into Syria, and the Byzantines gained some cities back along the coast and in western Anatolia as the Crusaders weakened Turkish forces. Alexios sent Byzantine detachments to claim surrendered towns. The empire regained Nicaea and other important positions. The Crusaders then established their own states in the Levant, and relations grew tense. Western lords treated captured land as their prize. Byzantine officials treated it as imperial territory temporarily managed by foreign soldiers. Both sides wrote letters and exchanged envoys. Both sides watched each other during negotiations with hands close to sword hilts. In Constantinople, court officials noted every insult and every breach of agreement. In the Crusader states, leaders told stories about Byzantine deception and Byzantine arrogance. The distrust hardened. The empire had gained time and some territory, and it had introduced a large armed Western presence into the Eastern Mediterranean. Men who followed their own goals and who distrusted the capital's bureaucracy. Alexios and his successors in the Komnenos family held the empire together through competence and constant attention. John II Komnenos campaigned steadily, pushing into Anatolia, securing roads, and reclaiming towns through siege and negotiation. Manuel I Komnenos followed with ambition and a taste for Western style. He held tournaments and cultivated Western knights while maintaining Byzantine administration. He fought in Hungary, in Italy, and against Turks, spending money to project strength. He married into Western dynasties and hosted Western envoys with expensive gifts. The empire in these years looked vigorous, and it also depended on an expensive machine. Armies required pay. Fortresses required upkeep. Diplomacy required bribes and dowries. The court required spectacle. When Manuel died in 1180, his heir was young, and the court's factions moved fast. Regents fought. Ministers were dragged from office. People in the city sensed weakness and became dangerous. Andronikos Komnenos arrived like a man stepping onto a stage he believed belonged to him. He had traveled, plotted, and survived exile. He understood the crowd. He walked into Constantinople in 1182 with supporters and used public anger against the regency. The city erupted in violence against Latin residents, merchants, and families who had lived in the city for years under imperial permission. Mobs moved through neighborhoods, breaking doors, looting shops, and killing people in the streets. Bodies lay in alleys. Survivors fled to ships. Andronikos took power and ruled with paranoia. He ordered arrests. He held trials that ended in mutilation and execution. He hunted rivals and used public punishment to keep people afraid. For a time, fear produced compliance. It also produced conspiracies. In 1185, after military failures and rising hatred, the city turned on him. He tried to flee. He was caught. The crowd tore at him, beat him, and killed him. Another emperor took the throne, Isaac II Angelos, and the pattern repeated: court factions, military weakness, financial strain, foreign threats. The empire's internal stability frayed, while external enemies watched and adjusted. The Fourth Crusade began as a plan to attack Egypt, a strategic target that could weaken Muslim control of the Holy Land. Western leaders gathered knights, ships, and money. Venice played a central role because Venice could build and supply a fleet large enough to transport an army. The Venetians negotiated a contract. The Crusaders promised payment. When the Crusaders arrived in Venice, their numbers were smaller than expected, and their funds fell short. Venetian officials met in halls with stone floors and banners on the walls. Doge Enrico Dandolo was old and blind, and he still ran the negotiation like a man who could smell weakness. He offered a solution. The Crusaders would help Venice capture Zara, a rival city on the Adriatic that had rebelled against Venetian control. The Crusaders agreed. They attacked a Christian city. They took it. The decision revealed the expedition's core problem. It depended on money and logistics controlled by Venice, and it depended on leaders willing to justify almost any action as temporary necessity. In the winter of 1202 and 1203, another offer arrived, carried by envoys and shaped by desperation. Alexios Angelos, a Byzantine prince, had fled Constantinople after his father Isaac II had been deposed and blinded by Isaac's brother Alexios III. The young prince promised the Crusaders vast sums of money, supplies, and military support if they helped him regain the throne. He promised submission of the Byzantine Church to Rome. He promised soldiers for the Crusader cause. Venetian leadership listened. Crusader barons listened. The offer solved immediate cash problems and offered political leverage. It also aimed the expedition straight at Constantinople. The fleet sailed east and appeared before the great city's walls in 1203. The site itself mattered. Tall masts in rows, painted shields, banners snapping, oars beating the water. The citizens crowded the sea walls and watched. Some shouted, some stared in silence. In the palace, Alexios III weighed his options and chose cowardice. He fled the city with treasure, leaving the government to collapse behind him. The Crusaders forced entry through a combination of naval assault and land pressure. They breached a section of the wall and set fires that spread into residential districts. Smoke rose. People carried children and bundles through streets choked with ash. Clergy held icons and tried to calm crowds. The Crusaders installed Isaac II back on the throne, despite his blindness, and placed the young Alexios IV beside him as co-emperor. The new regime owed money it could not produce. The palace demanded taxes and confiscations. Officials seized church plate. They seized property from wealthy households. They demanded forced loans. The population resented the new rulers and resented the foreign army camped outside and then inside parts of the city. Crusader soldiers grew impatient. Venetian merchants demanded payment. The promised money did not appear. The relationship turned poisonous. Clashes broke out. Fires started again. Neighborhoods burned. The foreign army viewed the city as a hostage. The city viewed the foreign army as an occupying force. In January 1204, a coup took place inside Constantinople. A man named Alexios Doukas, called Mortsouflos, seized power. He had a thick brow and a rough manner that appealed to people who wanted a strong defender. He removed Alexios IV. The young co-emperor was imprisoned and later killed. Isaac II died soon after. The new ruler, Alexios V, prepared for a siege. He reinforced walls. He ordered patrols. He attempted to rally the city. The Crusaders and Venetians responded by deciding that the city itself would pay. They held councils in tents and on ships and spoke openly about partition. They wrote agreements that divided future spoils and future territory. They planned like men arranging an estate sale. The assault began in April 1204. Venetian ships approached the sea walls with wooden towers built on decks. Sailors and soldiers climbed ropes and ladders under missile fire. Defenders threw stones and fired arrows. The first attacks failed. Men fell into the water. Some drowned. Some were dragged out and killed on the spot. The Crusaders regrouped. They attacked again. A breach opened. Once a few men gained a foothold, more followed. They spread along the walls and opened gates for forces on land. The defense collapsed in sections. Alexios V fled during the night, leaving the city to face the attackers without a central command. What followed looked like a controlled disaster. Crusader and Venetian forces poured into streets and began looting. Soldiers broke into houses and grabbed objects that could be carried. They ripped fabric from walls and took silver from tables. They seized jewelry from women and rings from dead men. They broke open church doors and searched for relics and gold. In Hagia Sophia, men climbed onto altars, pulled down ornaments, and carried away chalices and icons. Horses were led into sacred spaces because the soldiers needed somewhere to keep animals and did not care about local reverence. Fires spread again as looters used torches and as defenders attempted last stands in dense neighborhoods. The smoke rose over the city in thick columns. People fled to monasteries, to hidden courtyards, to any place with a door that could be barred. Some were dragged out anyway. Some were killed in front of their families. Some were raped. The violence lasted days. When it slowed, the city looked stripped. Many houses stood empty with broken doors. Streets held smashed pottery and torn fabric. Dogs fought over scraps. The empire's capital, the city that had survived sieges and civil unrest for 8 centuries, had been taken by an army that claimed to fight for Christ. The conquerors established a Latin empire in Constantinople. They installed a new emperor, Baldwin of Flanders, and divided offices among Western nobles. Venice took key ports and parts of the city, securing trade advantages with written charters and armed guards. Greek officials and aristocrats fled and formed successor states. One group gathered in Nicaea in Anatolia. Another held Epirus in the west. Another held Trebizond on the Black Sea coast. These were fragments of a broken government, run by men who carried imperial titles like luggage salvaged from a burning house. In Constantinople, the new Latin regime struggled. It lacked resources. It lacked local loyalty. It faced hostile neighbors. The city itself had lost population and wealth. Many artisans had fled. Many merchants avoided the port. The Latin rulers depended on support from the West that arrived in limited amounts. The situation became a long occupation marked by scarcity, political fragility, and constant threats. The betrayal in 1204 did not come from a single villain and a single moment. It came from a chain of incentives and decisions. A crusade assembled without adequate money. A contract negotiated by Venice that required payment. A diversion to Zara that proved the leaders would attack Christians when useful. A Byzantine prince offering cash and church submission in exchange for a throne. A Venetian leadership eager to punish Constantinople for past conflicts and to secure commercial dominance. Crusader lords eager for land and loot. Byzantine rulers who fled or fought each other while the walls faced siege. The sum of these choices produced a scene that looked simple only after it happened. Ships at the seawall, ladders, fire, looters in churches, a capital emptied of treasure. The ruins did not end the Byzantine story. They set the conditions for its final act. The successor states in exile continued to claim legitimacy. They collected taxes where they could. They recruited soldiers. They negotiated with Turks and with Western powers. In the years ahead, one of those states would return and retake the city, and the city would never return to its former strength. Constantinople would remain valuable, and it would remain vulnerable. The empire had been struck in its center by men who spoke the same prayers in a different language, and the damage lasted longer than any siege by an external enemy. A small group of men slipped through a postern gate near the Blachine walls just before dawn and walked along a narrow path to the water. They carried no banners. They carried a letter sealed with wax and a pouch of coin for the boatman. Behind them, Constantinople stood half empty, in places where whole streets had once been packed with workshops and homes. The Latin Empire still held the city in name, yet the Latin court struggled to pay soldiers and struggled to fill granaries. A Venetian warehouse stood guarded, while nearby houses sat abandoned with boarded windows. On the Asian shore, the Greek successor state at Nicaea gathered strength under rulers who wore imperial titles and used imperial offices as if the capital still belonged to them. In 1261, that long preparation turned into action. Michael Palaiologos, who ruled Nicaea, had troops near the city and had scouts watching the harbor. One night, a detachment moved quietly toward the land walls, while the main Latin force and many Venetian sailors were away on an expedition. The Greeks entered through a weak point, took control of key gates, and drove Latin defenders back in short, violent clashes that ended with running and shouting in the streets. Latin residents fled toward the harbor. Some reached ships, some were caught. When Michael entered Constantinople, he did it with ceremony because ceremony mattered, yet the scene around him showed the real condition of his prize. Churches stood damaged. Neighborhoods had fewer people than they once had. The treasury had little. The empire had returned to its capital and found a city that required repair like a wounded fortress, stone by stone, roof by roof, ledger by ledger. The Palaiologan regime kept the title and kept the rituals, and it faced enemies on every side with limited resources. The restored empire held parts of Thrace and parts of Greece and a few islands, and it also relied on agreements with Italian maritime powers that extracted privileges like toll exemptions and trading quarters. Genoese ships anchored in the Golden Horn and operated from Galata with their own walls and their own guards. Venetian merchants stayed active too. These foreign enclaves looked like neighbors and rivals at the same time. Inside the palace, officials argued about tariffs and military contracts while the countryside outside the city walls grew dangerous. Turkish groups in Anatolia expanded their territory through raids, treaties, and sieges. They took towns that had been Byzantine for centuries. They placed garrisons. they collected taxes. Byzantine commanders wrote reports that described new losses in plain terms and requested money and men that rarely arrived. In the Balkans, Serbian and Bulgarian rulers pushed their own claims. Civil wars inside Byzantium made the situation worse. Rival emperors raised troops, hired mercenaries, and paid them with promises of land and rights. When the money ran out, mercenaries looted, farmers fled, villages emptied. A civil war in the mid-14th century drew in Ottoman forces as allies, and those allies used the opportunity to gain a foothold in Europe. Ottoman troops crossed the Dardanelles, took positions, and built a base that became permanent. Byzantium still had walls around Constantinople and still had a navy in small numbers. The state had fewer soldiers, fewer taxpayers, fewer farms, and fewer options. The court continued to hold ceremonies under painted ceilings while the surrounding world narrowed. By the 15th century, Constantinople existed as a city under siege conditions, even during peacetime. The land outside the walls belonged to the Ottomans. The sea remained a route for supplies, trade, and occasional help from Western Europe, yet Western help came with conditions and arrived in limited force. Emperors negotiated church union with Rome in hopes of military support, and many in the city resisted those agreements with arguments and protests. The disputes filled churches and streets while Ottoman forces continued to tighten their control over the region. In 1451, Mehmed took the Ottoman throne and prepared for the final assault. He ordered the construction of a fortress on the European side of the Bosporus, positioned to control shipping. Work crews cut stone and hauled blocks into place. Soldiers guarded the site. The fortress rose fast, and its guns threatened any ship that tried to pass without permission. In Constantinople, Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos met with advisors and generals and stared at maps with fewer friendly territories than his predecessors had ever seen. He inspected the walls and counted towers that needed repairs. He counted men as well. The defenders included Byzantine troops, local volunteers, and a small but skilled contingent of Genoese, led by Giovanni Giustiniani. The total was thin for a city with walls this long. Constantine ordered repairs anyway. Men filled cracks with rubble and mortar. They reinforced weak sections with timber. They positioned cannons where they had them. They stretched the great chain across the mouth of the Golden Horn to block ships. The city prepared with the tools it still possessed: stone, sweat, and discipline. On the 6th of April 1453, Mehmed's army arrived and spread across the landward approaches. Tents went up in rows, supply carts moved through camps, soldiers dug trenches and positioned artillery. The largest cannon, built by a gun founder named Orban, required teams of oxen to move it. When it fired, the sound carried across the city and shook windows. The stone balls hit the walls and broke masonry. Dust rose. Fragments fell. Defenders ran with baskets and boards to patch breaches during lulls. The siege became a routine of explosions, repairs, sorties, and prayers. Ottoman sappers dug tunnels to weaken foundations. Byzantine defenders dug counter-tunnels and fought underground with knives and torches in cramped spaces. At sea, Mehmed attempted to force entry into the Golden Horn. He ordered ships hauled over land on greased logs to bypass the chain, and the operation worked. One morning, defenders on the walls saw Ottoman ships in the sheltered water behind them. The sight changed the geometry of defense. The city had fewer safe zones. The defenders shifted men and weapons to new positions. Food supplies tightened. Water remained available through cisterns, yet stress showed on faces and voices. Constantine moved along the walls often. He spoke to soldiers. He thanked them. He gave orders. He watched the damage accumulate and understood what it meant. On the night of May 28, Constantine attended a service in Hagia Sophia. Clergy held candles. The building smelled of wax and incense. People stood close together. Some cried. Some stared straight ahead. After the service, Constantine returned to the walls. Before dawn on May 29, Mehmed launched a full assault. Drums beat. Horns sounded. Waves of attackers moved forward under cover of darkness and smoke. The first waves included irregular troops sent to tire the defenders. They climbed ladders and rushed breaches. They died in large numbers. The defenders fought with spears, swords, and handguns where they had them. They threw stones. They pushed ladders away. Then the more disciplined Ottoman troops advanced, including janissaries. The fighting tightened at a key breach near the gate of St. Romanos. Giustiniani was wounded and carried away. The loss of that leader broke coordination in that sector. Defenders began to pull back. An Ottoman unit entered through a weak point and gained a foothold inside the walls. More followed. Constantine moved toward the fighting with his remaining guard. He wore armor. He carried a sword. He fought in close quarters amid shouting and bodies. He disappeared in the chaos. Later, survivors searched for him and spoke about his last moments in fragments, like men recalling a street fight they barely escaped. By midday, Ottoman forces controlled the city. Soldiers moved through streets and entered houses. Some people fled toward churches. Some hid in cellars. Some tried to reach the harbor. Mehmed entered later with officers and guards and rode toward Hagia Sophia. He dismounted and stepped inside. The building still held people who had gathered there in fear. Ottoman soldiers began taking prisoners. Mehmed gave orders to secure key areas and to stop uncontrolled destruction in places he wanted intact. Over the following days, the city's population changed through death, enslavement, flight, and resettlement. Constantinople became an Ottoman capital. Churches were converted or repurposed. Administrative offices reopened under new authority. The old imperial court ended. The title and the bureaucracy that had carried Roman identity for more than 1,000 years ceased to exist in practice. The aftermath spread beyond the city. Greek scholars, scribes, and clergy carried books and knowledge westward, traveling to Italian cities where patrons paid for Greek texts and instruction. Merchants adjusted routes and agreements to the new power. Orthodox Christian communities continued under Ottoman rule with new restrictions and new protections defined by Ottoman law and local practice. In Europe, rulers used the fall as a warning and as a political tool. In the Eastern Mediterranean, the Ottomans expanded further, using Constantinople as a base for administration and military power. The Byzantine Empire ended in the breach of a wall, in the collapse of a defense line, in a final charge with a sword in hand, and in a city absorbed into a different imperial system that kept the buildings and changed the rules.